Hello, everybody, and we're going to start on our next chapter of the text in our next lecture, which is on chapter 2 of the text, and it's on government, and we're going to talk about policing powers and constraints in this lecture today. So we're going to start diving into a more detailed view of administration starting after this chapter and moving forward. So, a couple quick housekeeping updates. I posted a discussion handout as well as a handout on the article critique, which was posted a couple days ago. If you have any questions about these, please email me on either assignment. I will check over your articles to tell you if it's good or anything like that. So both of those have been posted for y'all to look at and to get more information on the progress and on the assignments. So, we're going to start with a recap of what we covered last week for our beginning of the class. So, for a quick recap, we covered different types of organizations, and these included profits, nonprofits, and government organizations. For this chapter, we're going to focus more on government specifically. So, we're going to talk more about the government end of things in way more detail, especially related to criminal justice. So this is where criminal justice actually gets applied more, because the last chapter's been a lot of terms and stuff like that. So this is actually going to be a little bit more interesting when you're not dealing with so many terms as you are learning more about government and policing and stuff like that. So we're going to continue on after our recap and go into our definition of the government. So, we defined government earlier through the text, and as a recap, the government is a federal, state, or local agency who has the authority to administer government functions. And that was directly from our text, and we talked about this in chapter 1 as well. So, examples would include the government services would include building roads, providing clean water. The government does taxes, they're the ones who sent you that stimulant check. Those kind of services are provided by the government. Now, the government provides a lot of functions, but they may not provide these services directly, meaning that they may contract to third parties to make other people do their job. Like they might privatize, they may contract out a specific construction company to build the roads, or a specific company to clean your water, sewage, that kind of stuff. It's not directly done by the government. They have other third parties who participate. So, now that we have a little bit more on the government and we covered and reminded ourselves what the government is, in terms of how we're going to define it in this course, we're going to move on to policing powers. This is where CJ gets applied here, and it gets a little bit more interesting because we're going to talk about policing powers, legitimacy, authority, how the Constitution applies to some of this stuff. So it's going to be a little bit more interesting for y'all today. At least I hope it will be. So we're going to go into policing powers. So policing powers are the government's ability to limit or regulate, even prohibit personal or business activity without compensation. So they can prohibit, they can regulate anything with the goal to protect public health, safety, morality, and general welfare. So, simply put, in a more simple way, it is the power to create laws to regulate how businesses conduct, what FBA they can do, especially with the police, as we think of it more CJ related. The police have the power to prohibit people from doing certain activities which are based in law. So, there's a law that you can't speed more than, say, 65 on a road. Police are applying that law, and they're using their policing powers from the government. So this power of policing, it comes from traditional common law and the passage of the criminal laws, like I mentioned in our example, that they use those to protect the health and safety of others. So the goal of policing is to protect public health, safety, morality, and general welfare. So this is not necessarily the definition that applies directly to criminal justice. It can also be applied to in general, like they're policing your actions, but it also applies to the police for criminal justice related. So when you think about policing, make sure you keep that in mind, that both of those are applicable. You can think of it as either way. You can think of it as policing for regulating your activity, or policing as in police the cops. So make sure you keep that separate in some way or form. So it's important to go over like the constitutional amendments that apply to the policing aspect that we just mentioned. Your constitutional amendments, there are several amendments that provide these policing powers, and that's where they derive their power from. The Constitution provides that power through the 10th Amendment as well as the 5th Amendment for the concept of due process. And specifically with the 5th Amendment, government can use the eminent domain to take property away based on public interest. So, as we mentioned, that constitutional amendments are used to limit the power of the government's policing powers in other parts of the government. So, and that is through the 10th Amendment and then the 5th Amendment. And the 5th Amendment we're going to go into more detail of because it is the concept of due process and how it applies to policing. So, in general, due process can be simply explained as fundamental fairness. Now, by this point, since you all are pretty much juniors, seniors, the majority of you are juniors and seniors in this program, you know what due process is. So it's kind of referred to as a fundamental fairness. Now, what you may not have thought about is that how policing may be largely limited through due process. They have to follow all these rules and laws and statutes in order to police. And this is evident in multiple constitutional amendments, especially the 5th and the 14th. And each of these, the 5th and the 14th, each refer to different powers, either federal or state. So the 5th is due process, and it gives it to the federal powers, so anything federally related, policing, limiting. So it refers to the federal policing powers and limiting those through due process, while the 14th is on the state level, and it gives them states power to police, but limits it through, of course, due process. So we're going to continue on with this idea of due process and take it a little bit, like a step further, and talk about it with some of the safeguards. Now, these safeguards are kind of in place for not the government, but for us. They substantially limit the power that the government has over us in situations. And we'll give examples of some of these in a second here. So the first kind of safeguard is your substantive due process. And these are statutes and regulations. And this is essentially saying that you have to use a statute or a limitation of or like legislature that regulates the government and basically says that you can only police because of if it is a legitimate government activity. So you can't just do it arbitrarily, meaning just haphazardly and say I can do it because I said so. You have to have a legitimate legislature or statutes to back that up. So that is due process, substantive due process. Your other safeguard in this case is your procedural due process. What this does is it guarantees fairness in procedures where the government would deprive somebody of their personal property or liberty, so freedom. So this is where it exactly applies to policing and cops, because there's a lot of procedures that they have to follow in order to have a case against somebody, and the case to substand in court. So that would be your procedural due process, and this would include like arrests and interrogations, like how it is police procedure to give you the Miranda right before they arrest you, or saying that you had the right to a lawyer and all this. This is due process and procedural due process because they have to follow a procedure. So that would be an example of due process would be your interrogations, like your Miranda rights, and those would be more applied when you go into saying your procedures, and then when they're depriving people of their property and liberties, there's procedures that you have to go through. So that would be your procedural due process. And both of these safeguards will be limits your policing powers that the government has. So they're kind of in place for us, not necessarily the government. It just gives them more hoops to jump through, essentially. So those are your two safeguards with due process. So we're going to continue into the government power. And what I've been alluding to this entire time is that the government power is largely controlled and limited by the Constitution. So the Constitution and the amendments within it largely control the power of the government. And it limits it, it regulates it, all of that. And specifically with the 14th Amendment, as we talked about how it applies to due process just a second ago, we also have this idea of equal protections. And that is essentially stating like one of your, as like a procedure, you can think of it as a procedural due process that requires that laws must not be applied arbitrarily. I'm sorry, it wouldn't be a procedural due process, it would be your substantive due process because it's a statute. So it's your statute process, due process, with the 14th Amendment, which requires that laws not be applied arbitrarily. So you can't apply a certain law to one person and not to another. It has to be applied equally. So, and this is aptly termed equal protections, and a lot of this came up with the discrimination and the race issues, where police could racially discriminate against certain people because of the color of their skin. And this was the 14th Amendment, and they wanted to say that, hey, they can never be applied arbitrarily. So you have to punish or arrest and apply the law equally, no matter the color of the skin, no matter gender, religion, anything like that. It has to be applied non-arbitrarily. So it's a little bit about government power. Now we're going to apply it to criminal justice organizations, which is the real reason we're here. So criminal justice agencies are essentially created by the government to exercise this power of policing. So government created this idea of these agencies with their one soul to exercise that government's power. So they are given power by the government to police. So, in simpler terms, organizations like the criminal justice organizations in particular are going to be limited by the constitutional amendments. And you can tell by this with the, you're looking at police, if we're going to continue with the idea of police and the cops, a lot of your amendments apply to like the right to self-incrimination, searches and seizures are directly policing wise, that kind of stuff. So you can see how that applies there. So essentially what it means is that it's limiting your criminal justice organizations like your police agencies and stuff like that. They're going to be limited by the Constitution. So in one way, they're like an arm of the government. And because the government is limited, so too are these organizations. In addition to the limitations with the Constitution, there are even more other administrative challenges that criminal justice organizations may endure. And these are more criminal justice specific and not so applies to the others. For that reason, you'll see why. So a lot of the challenges that would impact a CJ system, they're going to be external, internal, and other types, and I'm going to go through a couple of them. So you can break them down into external challenges, and these come from an outside force. So these could include such things as like lawsuits, political demonstrations like protests. You see in the news lately, there's been protests about regulating the ability for government to reopen in states because of the COVID situation. So these definitely have an impact on CJ organizations. And then independent investigations. So like if something goes wrong, there's going to be an independent investigation, and other agencies will come in and have to investigate what happened. If you've been following what happened in Georgia recently, where the guy was shot for just running on he wasn't trespassing. He was running down the street. He was unarmed, and the DA decided not to charge the two guys who shot him. So it took a third party, which was the FBI, the Georgia Bureau of the FBI, to press charges and arrest the guys responsible for killing this unarmed man. So it took a completely different organization to do it, to come in and fix the malpractice, essentially. So that would be applying for example of that independent investigation. I thought about that recently when I was making this lecture, and how back when I saw the viral videos and such of the guy who was shot, and I thought about it, it would be a great example right now to use it for. So hopefully that helps you with something with current issues that have been happening recently. So other challenges. So we have other challenges that could incur. Like I said, these are all external. A good example for like a lawsuit would be like if somebody were to sue because of their a lot of times it would happen like an appeals process or something, saying that the government or police didn't follow correct guidelines and procedures. Some people sue for that, or using too much force. There would be a chance of a lawsuit and a protest. So those kind of all impact organizations equally in different ways. So we're going to further take a look at some of the internal challenges and other challenges that may apply as well. A lot of your internal challenges, and these mean internal meaning inside the organization, you would have your employee challenges, and those are stuff like whatever happens, like general workplace trauma that could happen here. So those would be kind of challenges. So that's not really CJ specific, although you can argue that it could be, because you're going to have employment challenges no matter what organization you look at. But specifically for CJ organizations, especially in like police agencies and stuff like that, being an employee, being a police officer especially, you're carrying a different, you carry more weight because you have a different challenge of you could die but exercising the government's rights. So that might influence it and be more specific to a CJ organization. But yeah. And then some of the other challenges, the book mentions a few more that I wanted to go over. Includes like budget restrictions, unions, and then contracts with third parties. So like your suppliers, your lawyers, all those types of third parties that might be involved. Or if like the government privatizes, which is a big thing for corrections right now. Private industries doing their job, trying to privatize prison system, the prisons and the jails in different states. So that would be an example of that third-party contracts. They may have issues there. In budget restrictions, that's going to apply directly from the government. If they cut the budget or something, that would be a major challenge to policing and stuff, either at the state level or at the federal level. So, kind of like a recap, we looked over some challenges that impact the criminal justice organizations, and we included external challenges as well as internal challenges and other types as well. So, I'm going to run that through a little bit more and do a recap. There are a lot of different challenges that are specific to CJ organizations, including your protest, your other investigations, lawsuits, employment challenges, budget restrictions, unions, and contracts. These would all impact CJ organizations. So the last thing we're going to really cover, I guess the second to last thing we're going to cover today is kind of like the makeup and positions inside of a government agency. So this is taken away from like taking a different look, and this is not just criminal justice specific, this is any government agency. So we're taking a step back and not looking at specifically criminal justice, but looking at it a little bit differently. So there are several positions in a government agency. The ones that we're going to focus on today include your elected officials, as well as your appointed officials and career service employees. And those are the three that we're going to focus on right now. So we're going to go into elected officials. So elected officials, as you may know, they're not service employees, so they don't count as a service employee. They are elected into their position, which means they rely on the public to keep electing them into that position. So that means the government does, or if people don't approve of what this person's doing, they can kick them out on the next election cycle and elect somebody new there. So examples of this would include your sheriff or your district attorneys. These are elected officials. If we take the example of a sheriff, he's elected into a position, and then if he doesn't do a good enough job, the public can decide, and he runs for re-election. The public can, sorry, but I'm stumbling on my words today. The public can decide whether to elect him again for another tenure or take him out. So that would be an example of elected officials. So now we're going to go into appointed officials. And these are usually officials who were hired by your elected officials. So people, if we're going to continue with our example previously, the sheriff is going to appoint a deputy. That would be an example, like appointing a deputy, or the president appointing people to the Supreme Court is an example. So these are officials that are hired by the elected officials. And you typically get one of these positions, appointed position, because of your relationship, whether it's personal or professional, with the elected official. So you have to have that relationship, or else he's not going to elect you if he doesn't know you, appoint you if he doesn't know you. So a lot of these could follow political party lines, and you see that with the president. Where they like to appoint people who are in their same political party. So currently, like, Trump would probably appoint a Republican into the Supreme Court if that option was, if he had to appoint somebody. And this would, because they're more likely to agree with him in his, what he's talking about and wants to pass, versus a Democrat, if he appointed a Democrat. Sorry, my watch was talking to me. Okay, so that would be your examples of the appointed officials and what appointed officials mean in the government agency. And our last of the three government positions was going to be your career service employees. And these are just the normal employees who serve within the government agency. And I say they have to follow through the motions, which means that they have to go through your standardized tests, your application process, interviews, if you were going to get a normal job, it would be the same thing. So that is just, career service to employees is just like that umbrella word to say like a normal employee who wasn't elected or appointed. So, and if you think of this as like a hierarchy with these positions in government agencies, you can think of it kind of like as a hierarchy. Because your elected official is probably going to be at top, especially if he's a sheriff. And he's going to hire or appoint his deputies. And then people below that would be your career service employees. So like citizens that help out the who are not law enforcement agents, who do like administrative stuff and that kind of stuff, administrative functions and stuff. So you can think of it kind of like a hierarchy. So those are the couple positions within a government agency. So the last thing we're going to cover is going to be the authority and legitimacy. Now we're going to talk about authority first. So technically, the CJ system is made up of a set of state institutions which authorize the police to use force. So the powers kind of rest on the assumption that the authorities will only carry out state orders from the court. But does this always happen that way? If you think about corrupt officers and stuff, or people who like to just apply it willy-nilly, they're not carrying state orders. We like to think they are, but they're not. So that's the issue with the power and authority here, is that are we always carrying out state orders, or is there some other party involved that influences that order, like quotas and stuff like that come up. So that's that idea. Further, the authority is provided by the government to the organization, not by the individuals in the organization. So that means that all the authority to use force and police people comes directly from the government. The government gets that directly from the Constitution. So it's kind of like it flows downward. Starts with the Constitution. Government receives power from the Constitution. Thus, the government creates an organization to do its policing and regulating. That organization receives the authority and power from the government, who receives the power from the Constitution. So the organization has the power, not the individual. That's kind of what I was trying to point out, and how it kind of trickles down. The power trickles down throughout. So lastly, we're going to cover legitimacy of a criminal justice organization. Now, this one's kind of a more tricky subject, especially according to the book. With this book, I don't think they did a great job of explaining the legitimacy issue here, so I'm going to try and do it in an easier fashion. I don't know how much easier I can explain it here, but legitimacy is not promised, and it's a matter of perception. So if you don't view a criminal justice organization as legitimate, then they won't see any encounter with that organization as valid and fair. So if you don't think that the police have legitimate power, any interaction you have with the police is going to be bad, because you think that they don't have the power. So that's kind of what that meant. Hopefully that explains the legitimacy example a little bit better. If you have a really good way of explaining it, please let me know. I would be all ears to hear some of your examples that you come up with. If you think of something that is more interesting and easier to explain for legitimacy. So that pretty much wraps up the chapter 2 of the book, and the government and policing powers. So with a little bit of a recap, we covered what the government was and how the government derives its power, which was from the Constitution, and then how the constitutional amendments like the 10th, the 5th, and the 14th all give the government that power to police and regulate. And then we kind of talked about how criminal justice organizations derive their power, and then the challenges that impact CJ organizations specifically. And then we also talked a little bit about positions within a government agency, and that was going to be including your elected officials, your appointed officials, and career service employees. And then lastly, what we just covered was information on the authority of a criminal justice organization, and briefly the legitimacy of criminal justice organizations. So that pretty much wraps us up for this lecture. The next one is going to be on systems and kind of theory. Next one's going to be pretty dense, so look forward to make sure you do your readings beforehand. It might be helpful. We also have an extra reading for the next chapter too, which explains systems a little bit better than the book. So I would read them both or skim them both, just to have a little bit of an idea before we go on into the next chapter, because the next chapter is a little bit denser to understand. It has multiple parts, so look forward to that, and that will be up soon too as well. But I hope you all have a great afternoon, night, morning, whenever you're watching this video. Time is irrelevant at this point, it feels like. Anyways, so y'all have a great afternoon, evening, and everything, and I'll talk to y'all soon. Thank you.